instructed, and this is super clear, you don't tell people what you've learned. That's the reason why they were able to hold such power in Egypt. So that brings up the next point. Somewhere along the lines, and we can see how easily these lines get blurred, where priests of these various religions, whatever the religion is of the people, and the wise counselors, this begins to interact very closely. Some have a specialization in their religion, and some have a specialization in what we might call other sort of secular knowledge, but it begins to really, the lines get blurred very quickly. For example, if you're the royal architect in Egypt, and you are part of the Magi class, like you are the priest in Egypt, or Babylon, or Nineveh, or any of the places we're quickly traveling. Now that we're starting to think a little bit differently about who Magi are, I'm looking specifically at the relationship between kings and Magi and some of our other Bible stories. I'm intrigued in our nativity story about why they're able to confidently show up and why they're obliged to go to Jerusalem first and deal directly with the king. You don't just show up into town and not see the king in the Matthew chapter 2 story, because the kings and the Magi go hand in hand, and they're inseparable, because a Magi without a king is a Magi without a job. Are you with me? Or a proconsul, or somebody of high importance that needs a court of advisors around him. So of course they show up to see him first, even though it might be an awkward moment. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are unwise in telling the king the real reason why they came. The unwise thing would be to lie to the king about the real reason why they came. So they have to tell Herod, we came all this way to find this babe that's born a king, even if you don't like it. Because the alternative, to be deceptive to the king, is not what is done in the code of the Magi. Are you with me so far? So, briefly, I want you to just consider a couple other stories that we're very familiar with, that we usually don't ever think about the Magi, because we have another word that we like better, and for good reason we like it better. We have words like prophet that we like better, because we know that when we say prophet, specifically a prophet that we admire, he's going to get his information, or she, from the living God. But then again, wait a second. We know that even among the prophets, there are these true prophets of God, and there are these false prophets of God. So once again, the battle between good and evil, you've got both, like good Magi and you've got evil Magi. You've got the good priests and you've got the evil priests, and you've got the good prophets and you've got the fake or evil prophets. And now think about the stories that you know where these prophets keep getting audiences with whoever's king. Think about it for a moment. Jeremiah, how is it that you keep getting an audience with the king? And even though he doesn't like you, he's got these other people that he calls prophets. It's a Jewish context after all. So we're not using a Persian word that is translated into Greek like Magi. We're using different words now, but it's the same principle of the royal court. The advisors to the king have not only an education they can read and write, but they have access to mysterious and esoteric knowledge that the king oftentimes just is baffled by. But you got to tell me things that I need to know, things that I can't know otherwise unless you hear from it, or unless you can hear from the spiritual realm. So I mentioned Jeremiah, but consider Elijah for just a moment. You've got a king named King Ahab, and every time I think about King Ahab, ooh, right? And because he's a bad guy, he's also an insecure man, kind of like Herod, right? I mean, if only you were more confident in yourself, maybe you wouldn't be so influenced by your evil wife in his case. He's always trying to prove himself, kind of like Herod. And he's got this prophet out there. Now, this prophet hears from God. But this prophet Elijah, they have this strained relationship, but he keeps getting an audience, if you will, directly from the king because he's part of this class. Now, at least from the perspective of Herod, or rather Ahab, because Ahab is a king, and a king's goal is to have all the best people at their right and at their left. But Elijah would have nothing to do with that. You might remember that it didn't rain for years until essentially Elijah said it would rain. At least that's from Ahab's perspective. But I want you to think about a couple other stories very briefly that you might not think about in this context. Now, you don't think about probably Abraham. I'm talking about Father Abraham, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob Abraham. You might not think of Abraham as a king. But if you were a king living not too far from Abraham, you did. As a matter of fact, we have some stories in Genesis that says Abraham was treated as a king by the other kings. Abraham even led other kings in a reconnaissance mission in order to rescue a whole bunch of people that had been taken captive by competing kings. Abraham had a whole workforce that worked for him that essentially gave him this role and influence as though he was a king. Now, why am I mentioning Abraham? Because Abraham does something so interesting. It always bugged me until I began to get deeper into this story. That he would send his servant to go to a faraway land as his ambassador. And this servant is supposed to be able to hear in the spiritual realm a message from God to come back with a wife for his son. And it's like, Abraham, just go get that wife, or send Isaac, but you send your servant, and this servant is supposed to be led by God, and you're going to trust him with whoever your son is going to marry, and then the next generation, you see Isaac do the same thing. He sends a servant over. Now, if I see that servant is not merely a lowly servant, but actually as this close confidant, as this advisor, as this trusted individual that also has the wisdom that you can leave your entire legacy, your posterity, any future grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and all the promises of God that are tied with that are going to rest in your hands. Who are you? So, as we're discussing Magi in different contexts, or wise counselors, or the court of a king, I'm looking at all the stories, both good and bad. I'm looking at, now, going full circle for the sake of time, I'll jump right back to Daniel real briefly and tell you what I think. And there's different stories and different traditions. Some people have named these guys around 500 or 600 years later. They give these guys names. So some people have been born with tradition saying, "Oh no, that's Gaspar and Belteshazzar or Balthashar." And some of the traditions have these names for the wise men, but who are they? Well, some would say, I think they're from China. Others say, I think they're from India. There are some traditions that say there's actually one from each, one from Persia, one from India, one from Africa. So we've got all these different ideas, but from my perspective and my research this far, I'll just tell you this real briefly. I think they're simply from the region of Babylon or Susa. I think that they are direct descendants from the school of the Magi that Daniel was put in charge of. Now, there are many, many, many teachings where people are super confident that these are the first Gentiles to recognize Jesus as the Christ. But even that, I'll be honest with you, I'm not convinced. I actually think it's possible, and I'm not saying this authoritatively, I just think it's possible that they themselves could have been Jewish. You might remember that in the exile, the Babylonian exile I mentioned, and even the story of Esther when they were in Susa. Susa was the capital of the Persian Empire. You can find them on the map today, modern-day Iran. But there were many Jews that were left. They didn't all come back. There were many Jews at the time living there. And Daniel himself, as I mentioned, was in charge of the school of both Jewish now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and whoever else that are unnamed, and other foreigners that he saved because they were going to be killed, but they weren't killed because God used Daniel, so they were allowed to live. But if Daniel's going to be in charge, think about this for a moment. Is he not going to make sure that the scriptures that come from God are part of the curriculum of education? I personally think that you're not educated until you're educated in the Bible. I personally think it's inconceivable that you have a clue around you really in terms of, understanding real life and the life that we live, the life that we see, the environment that we are living in until you have some information from God's Word. I think it's part of the reason why He gave us the Bible. That we could essentially open our eyes in the morning, go to work, interact with human beings, go home, sit down with your family, raise some kids, and have a clue about your life and its purpose and meaning. And I think that's part of the reason why God gave us the Bible. To me, it's inconceivable that Daniel would be put in charge of the whole shebang without bringing the Holy Scriptures into the required curriculum. That includes the prophecies. And I think that is the reason why, when the time came, that they knew what to see using their knowledge of the skies, of the world, and of the sciences. Now, there is some history recorded that in 5 BC, the Chinese saw this mysterious star, this comet without a tail, they record, in the eastern sky. And many of us think that actually might be the very star of Bethlehem that they saw. What's interesting is now we have enough understandings that if by chance that star appeared in April, for example, it took them a few months journey, they'd see it in the east, and they'd tell us that by the time they would get to Jerusalem, it would appear in the south. Why does that matter? Well, if we were looking at the story that we just read in detail, we'd notice that they saw the star in the east. They didn't follow the star to Jerusalem. You know that, right? It didn't say that they followed the star. That's in the songs. That's in the Christmas specials. They didn't follow the star. They saw the sign in the sky, and then they knew, get to Jerusalem. So they went. And then the scripture that we read says, but when they were in Jerusalem, hey, there's the star again. But now it's in the south. Which is exactly what we might expect in that situation I was just describing to you. And then it would essentially be shining right over Bethlehem. So many people will look to that. If you're concerned about the 5 BC part, actually you shouldn't be, because our calendar just got about 500 years after Christ. Our calendar got messed up by about 4 years or so. So 5 BC is perfect for about when Jesus would be born. So let me bring this to the part that matters to you. I think this is the most important part I want to say in our study of the kings. Jesus is a king. I opened with that. I want to make sure that I emphasize that the whole way through. He is not just a king, he is a King of kings.